Stick around because in this video I'm going to be explaining what it's like on a combat deployment for the MOS of an 88 Mike in the United States Army. What is up, my friends? I'm U.S. Army veteran Christopher Chaos, and on my channel I like to kind of educate people or entertain people and kind of facilitate maybe your curiosity for some things about the United States Army, about what it's like in different situations, different jobs, whatever the case might be, with this particular video focusing on what it is like in a combat zone for an individual that is in the United States Army in the MOS of an 88 Mike. Now, for those of you unfamiliar of who I am and what I've done and everything like that, well, I was an 88 Mike in the United States Army, and I deployed twice to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now, if all of this sounds like some interesting stuff to you and this is the type of content you're interested in, well, then maybe think about subscribing to this channel, also clicking on that bell to enable notifications and become a part of that awesome notification platoon so that you can get alerts when new videos go live, to include those live streams. Now let's talk about basically what it was like from my perspective as an 88 Mike of what I was doing while on a combat deployment. So during both of my deployments, there were some things that were very different, but some things that were very common and very similar during each deployment. Obviously, the mission of an 88 Mike is transportation. What that transportation is, what you're hauling, can vary during different missions, during different situations, during different environments and everything. So I can really just give the experience from my two deployments as far as what I did to maybe give you a better idea as to some of the missions that an 88 Mike might do while on these combat deployments. During my first deployment, I was with the 30th ACR out of Fort Carson, Colorado. So we were there for that deployment for 12 months. And during that one, there was a lot of humanitarian aid missions that were going on. These missions include us going out to the local areas to, provide food to some of the, civilians that were maybe in need of, just a better lifestyle, better living. Maybe we're, hurting for food or water or whatever the case was. So we would go to these locations, these different villages, these different areas, with escorts. We would have, security with us and everything, but we'd be taking these trucks that were maybe carrying a bunch of food or a bunch of water. So we'd go out to these areas and we'd be downloading food and water or whatever to these local civilians in this area to help them in their situations. So you'd often show up and there'd usually be a lot of people there. They see us carrying these trucks with a bunch of water or food on them, and they'd come rush to the vehicle, and you're trying to keep them back a little bit, but the excitement, I guess, of them really wanting this water or whatever the case was usually got a little crazy, a little hectic at times. So it definitely put you on edge a little bit, hoping that none of these people are hostile. They're usually pretty eager to want to help you, like download the water off the truck or whatever, maybe the food or the boxes of food, and kind of distribute that out. So that's usually what you were doing. You were stopping off at the designated area. You have some kind of security in the area that's kind of keep an eye on the crowd and everything. You're, downloading, stuff. I remember usually I would have, maybe one soldier maybe up on the truck, maybe downloading some of the equipment or some of the water or food or whatever. Other individuals would probably be security, kind of keep an eye on the crowd and everything, making sure nobody, tried to, get out of hand or grab one of the soldiers or, anything crazy like that. So there is a lot of security there. There's also the gun trucks that are in that area with the, mounted crew served weapons that are also in the area to kind of keep secure a little bit, trying to keep a little bit of, control of what's going on. I remember, I think most of the cases, there was also like local national police or military in the area to also kind of assist. So that was one of the big missions. This was all taking place during the daytime because in Iraq they had a curfew kind of standard to where they weren't allowed to be out past a certain time, and they couldn't be on the road before another specific time. So we were doing this during the daytime when everybody's awake and when there wasn't a curfew in place at that time. So that was one of the key missions. Another mission that was both very common with this deployment and my second deployment was log packs. Log packs or logistical patrols. These were, where we have to support other individuals, other people from our unit, or maybe even some other cases, other units. But we had our main operating area for my first deployment, which was Talafar, and then my second deployment was inside of Baghdad at the Baghdad International Airport on Camp Liberty, and those are our main operating areas. But then we would also additionally have some of our individuals at these other remote locations, in this case called a COP, or a combat outpost. So we had to still support those units with fuel, with ammo, with food, whatever the case was, whatever type of supplies they were still needing. Sometimes this would be a daily operation, sometimes we rotate, sometimes, you didn't always have to go every day. It really kind of varied on, it wasn't a really set schedule as far as that, but a lot of typically, either if it was daily or every other day or whatever, usually had 2 missions that we would do, 2 log packs. We would do one in the morning and one in the evening most commonly. They did usually mix it up for, reasons to, not make it too much on a schedule. You don't want to go and be really predictable, even though there's units coming and going off these installations all the time anyways, but you usually didn't want to make it too common as far as, if someone was observing the convoys, trying to figure out what time does this unit, leave the base at this time or whatever. So, it would kind of fluctuate between, early in the morning, maybe a little bit later, whatever, and then different times as far as when we leave. But like I said, we usually had one either in the morning and one in the evening, sometimes both, sometimes only one or the other. It really varied, but it's what we were doing was taking out like maybe breakfast chow or taking out dinner chow or taking out maybe fuel to resupply some individuals with fuel or the ammo to these locations. So this meant having those particular trucks, with that cargo that needs to be on there, plus the gun trucks to provide security. Sometimes we were also escorting other individuals who maybe needed to go out there to spend the night or spend a few days out there. So you take those individuals out there. So these log packs were very common. During my first deployment, we had a couple of places we had to go to. One of them was pretty far out, so sometimes that mission would take a little bit longer because it was a farther of a drive. During my second deployment, we had like 4 or 5 different cops that we had to kind of man. So those ones were a little bit kind of alternating to where we couldn't usually hit up all of them in one shot. So it'd usually be like, hey, maybe we're gonna hit up a couple of them on this day, and then the next following day or the day after that or whatever, we'll hit up these other individual ones. But log packs were a very common thing as an 88 Mike that we were doing during these combat deployments, was resupplying our other units and sometimes other units as well with the supplies that were needed from that main installation. Sometimes as an 88 Mike, you were just working the gun trucks. We had our own security that we would have for these log packs or other types of missions, for like even those humanitarian aid missions during my first one, where we had our own gun trucks, our own gun crew, and it was usually 88 Mikes that were the drivers of these gun vehicles. During my first deployment, we were just using Humvees, but my second deployment, we were using MRAPs. So you had 88 Mikes that were the drivers. You had 88 Mikes that were the vehicle commander. You also had 88 Mikes that were the gunners inside of these gun trucks. So sometimes you'd be an 88 Mike and be driving the truck carrying the cargo, or sometimes you're an 88 Mike, being on the gun crew, being in that gun truck. Both times we kind of designate individuals that were for either most of the deployment, if not all of the deployment, kind of just dedicated to being on the gun crew. So typically we had that kind of pre-designated, and then the other individuals were designated to always do log packs or always do these specific type of missions. Another common mission that we did during my second deployment was barrier missions. When we were in Baghdad, we had to take these concrete barriers out to different locations, either for checkpoints or for maybe Iraqi, police stations, or just for areas to block off the road so that, we can kind of limit the possibilities of ambushes or VBIDs or whatever type of threat that may be in that area. So we'd be doing these missions at nighttime because of that curfew that I talked about earlier. It was very key to make sure that we were doing these operations when we didn't have to worry about traffic. We didn't have to worry about the local civilians being out and about. So we would have a little bit more kind of freedom to be able to move the convoy, but also not have to worry about the local populace while we're trying to lay these concrete barriers in the positions and everything. So we usually had a civilian crane operator that would go with us. We had our gun trucks again. We had our other cargo vehicles. In this case, we were using the PLS vehicles, and we'd use the PLSs to carry the concrete barriers on them. There was a few times maybe tractor trailers, but the PLSs in this case were the main common vehicles we were using, and we carry those barriers to wherever they needed to go to, and this was usually an all-night operation. So you would typically have, some kind of rest plan, hopefully both for my first deployment or my second deployment, to kind of prepare you if you had a night mission. So if you knew that you're gonna be on a night mission, they might say that, hey, make sure that you go get some rest by this time because we're gonna be out from, let's say, maybe 10 o'clock at night to 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, whatever the case was. That wasn't always the situation though. There was sometimes as, you had a lot of stuff going on during the day that you just didn't get a chance to get the rest that you wanted to be able to get to prepare you for that. It's best to get, the rest that you need so you can stay alert and not have to fight trying to stay awake, but there were times where that just wasn't an option available to you. because you'd be driving, so sometimes that's tiring. If you're tired, it's you get sleepy, just driving behind the wheel. It's a boring task for some people, so sometimes it's hard to stay awake, especially if you're the vehicle commander. You're just sitting in the passenger seat looking out the window. You got to fight to stay awake if you haven't got proper sleep. There's also times where you're just kind of waiting for your turn to get your vehicle downloaded. And so sometimes that'd be a little bit of a struggle if you didn't get proper amount of rest prior to the mission to try to stay awake, before you're waiting for your turn to get downloaded with the, the equipment off of your vehicle. Often I would sometimes dismount, you're trying to help out with local security, and if it was a safe area to be able to do so where you didn't need to stay inside your vehicles, obviously your vehicle's armored, so if you don't need to get out of that armored vehicle, then you shouldn't do so. But if there were situations where I could dismount and maybe walk around a little bit and kind of assist with the situation, what was going on, that was always helpful to kind of stay alert and stay awake and kind of walk around a little bit. So that was a lot of the main missions I was doing as an 88 Mike on these combat deployments, but there was, some days here and there where you weren't always just going outside the wire. You definitely went outside the wire, outside the base as an 88 Mike quite often because you're doing a lot of convoys, you're doing a lot of transportation, moving equipment around. So it's definitely not one of those MOSs where you're, lock into being on the base the entire deployment like some MOSs are. But when you're not going off base to go do some of these, type of missions, well, there's usually a lot of work to do in the motor pool with maintenance on your vehicles, sometimes things on base to move things from one location to another location. For example, usually for maintenance type of reasons, you'd have to go to one specific yard to go pick up all the parts that were needed for maintenance on maybe your whole company, your whole troop, or whatever, type of unit. For their, maintenance of their vehicles or whatever, you would go and have to drive over to that area, have all that stuff loaded on your truck to bring back to your motor pool area for our maintenance crew to be able to use those tools or to use those parts or whatever to get stuff fixed. So sometimes there was on-base missions of having to just move stuff from one yard that was received from over to your area or whatever the case was. And then there's also some missions that were taking place off-base. There's the term that gets thrown around called a FOBIT. Those are individuals that stay on the base and never leave the wire. As an 88 Mike, you're definitely not going to be a FOBIT in most cases. Unless you have some kind of crazy situation where you're doing something really outside of what an 88 Mike normally does, then yeah, maybe. But if you're doing your 88 Mike job, which a lot of individuals are usually doing because transportation is very key and very needed to get those supplies to those remote locations or whatever the mission might be, you're definitely not going to be a FOBIT. You're going to probably go outside the wire quite often. As far as how much free time I had as an 88 Mike on a combat deployment, that definitely varies. There's definitely some moments where I had a lot of free time and I had opportunities to maybe watch some movies on a laptop or, maybe just, hang out with some of the people that I was cool with or whatever the case might be. And then there's also times where I had very little time. I definitely, though, did not have any times where I had nothing going on that day where I got to just sleep in and, just do nothing all entire day. There was definitely not that kind of a situation. There was always at least something going on every single day that I had. I didn't have weekends off, nothing like that. But there was definitely, maybe some moments where maybe I'd get, several hours of free time and then a lot of other times where I'd get very few, free time. Some of the biggest challenges I think as an 88 Mike on a deployment is usually the long missions. You're doing these long convoys, you're doing these late night missions, you're sometimes having to, do maintenance on your vehicles or work with the mechanics on your vehicles or get missions done on the base and then, turn around and that night go on some kind of late night mission. So you're getting very little rest sometimes. So that definitely made it rough being in that MOS on a combat deployment because of, some of these long convoys, these long missions that might take a long time to drive to the location or just simply having to, wait to get downloaded, to get the equipment off of your vehicle. And so that is very kind of tiring, frustrating, exhausting, a lot of kind of things that kind of play into that to make it difficult on a combat deployment for an 88 Mike. Some positives as an 88 Mike was I got to see quite a bit. You have individuals that were, sure, FOBITs, so where they were stuck on the base and they didn't get to see anything outside of what was on that fob or when they initially showed up there. But me as an 88 Mike, you're going on a lot of missions, so you're going to a lot of different locations and you're going to see a lot of different kind of examples of the cultures in different areas. So I got to see, in Iraq, I got to see some of the palaces. I got to see some of the more kind of built up areas, what that was like in Iraq compared to some of the more desolate areas. So I definitely got a bigger experience as to what the different areas looked like and what the different cultures were like, interacting with some civilians, for some of those missions, and just a little bit more of a greater experience as to what the culture was like in that area for some situations, not maybe as much as like, someone living there or I guess, staying there for certain other, missions or whatever. But with a little bit of interaction that I did get with like some of the Iraqi police individuals or Iraqi army individuals, you definitely got to experience some of the culture and learn a little bit about that area. Now let's carry on the conversation down in the comment section. So I have some questions for you. If you were someone that was on a deployment, whether it was a combat deployment or a non-combat deployment, then I'd love to hear, some of your experiences as to maybe some things that you liked about your deployment or things you didn't like about your deployment that was kind of, focused on your MOS. Now, for those of you that maybe have not been on a deployment, not even in the military at all yet, what are your questions about a deployment? Whether it's a combat deployment or a non-combat deployment, maybe I can answer them down in the comments, or some of my veteran viewers can help you out and give some answers to maybe some questions you've had about deployments. Now, to keep your experience going with this particular topic, I'm going to pin a comment at the very top down in the comment section that gives you a link to one of my previous videos about 5 things that you're not allowed to do in a combat zone. So definitely after this video, go check that out. Also, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that thumbs up. Check out links down in the description. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. See ya.